forced displacement and forced movement in the 19th century. But today, American Indians represent about less than 2% of the population. We are one of the fastest growing minority groups in the country. But I think the important thing to note is that you see this sort of diversity of tribes and peoples is that there's a ton of diversity here with as much linguistic and cultural difference as, say, between English or Americans and Chinese or Mongolians. There's a lot of difference within this. But there also can be pretty large regional similarities as well. You'll kind of see that if you look at the state of Oklahoma, you'll see a lot of blue areas in there, and we'll actually talk about that in a bit. But in places like the South and in Oklahoma, there's reservation land and tribal jurisdictional areas. There's different types of reservation land. But the important thing to note is that this is also considered a type of federal land. It's not public land, but it's federal land as well. But we'll get into that. But the important thing to take away here is that there's a lot of different Native peoples and a lot of tribes in this country. So there is a concept when I say, tribes are nations. We very much are in that sense. There's an idea called tribal sovereignty. If anything you take away from this is this is an important one. This is what defines Native peoples in a very different way than other minority groups in this country. And this is a part of the Constitution, actually. Article 6 says that treaties are law of the land. Well, up until about 1874, there was somewhere close to around 300 to 400 treaties signed between the United States and Native nations. These are very much like a treaty that would be signed between the United States and Russia over the control of nuclear arms. But in doing so, the United States inadvertently recognized Native nations as sovereign nations. And better or worse, if that wasn't the intent, that's what happened. But, in large part, this was because the United States, and sort of as an early nation in the 1700s, was trying to be seen as legitimate by European powers. And if you think about what a nation state does, they sign treaties. They exert themselves in sort of these larger spheres. And in large part, the United States saw signing treaties with Indian nations as that sort of pathway to being deemed legitimate. It's kind of a funny outcome, but it's one of the things that is sort of very unique to the United States as compared to others. Some high-level things here. This is just going through very early history very quickly, but there's this thing called the Marshall Trilogy. So we talked about, how many tribes there are. We talked about how, the number of treaties that there are. But one of the things that defines the relationship between these two nations, tribal nations and the federal government, is the series of Supreme Court cases from the early 19th century. They're called the Marshall Trilogy. John Marshall was the Supreme Court justice that oversaw all of these cases. But these series of cases in large part were caused by friction and other sorts of legal battles, and also bloodshed that was occurring sort of on the fringes of the early American Republic in the colonies, largely in Georgia between the Cherokees and white settlers in the area. So this first, I'll very highly gloss these over, but I'll try to give you the big takeaways of what this means and why this matters to public land. But this first case, Johnson versus Macintosh, is basically that I believe it was Macintosh was gifted a parcel of land from his father when he passed away. But Johnson, who was another landowner, basically said, hey, I actually bought this parcel from an Indian tribe that was here. And there was a whole legal battle over that. And what eventually came out of that in Supreme Court case is that the federal government actually cited a law from the Pope written in 1493, the Papal Bull, which was the doctrine of discovery, basically saying that it's fairly unique, but basically saying that all land that belonged to non-Christians was available for conquest and taking. But in this, the United States asserted this idea that these Indian lands were conquered, and therefore this meant a transfer of title. However, Congress said Indians can still continue to live on this land as long as Congress says they can do so. And that's the important thing to note that's very critical at a lot of these relationships between the federal government and tribes is Congress has the say at the end of the day. And lastly, remember when I said Indian lands are federal lands, it's this last piece. Indian land cannot be sold or exchanged without the consent of the federal government. The federal government has title to Indian lands, and this is why we call it federal Indian trust land. It's supposed to be managed for the benefit of Native peoples. So the big takeaway here, doctrine of discovery, Indians lose title to land, and Congress controls all of what happens with this land, and the title belongs to the United States government. The second of these,
really quick. Sorry.
Yep.
I don't know if we're supposed to be moving through the slideshow, but I think it's frozen on that main slide for us.
Oh no. Okay.
I just wanted to check because
no, I was, yeah.
I think he's like talking along with the slide. The information's still amazing, and we are using.
Yeah. Okay. Here we go.
So, perfect. We're
there
good.
We go. That's funny. So the second of these cases, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. Is this idea that, tribes are not foreign nations. Basically, the Cherokee Nation was saying, hey, state of Georgia, your laws don't apply here. And, we're an independent nation. We don't belong to the United States. Supreme Court says, nope, you kind of exist in this other area of sovereignty as known as domestic dependent nations whose relationship is literally, they define as a guardian to a ward. Very patronizing language to Native peoples. But this was a precursor to what was then known as the Trail of Tears. You can look into that later if you want. But the last of these is Worcester versus Georgia. Basically, there was, the big takeaway from this is that there was an Indian landholder, state of Georgia was trying to impose laws on Indian land. The big thing is to note is that state laws don't apply on tribal lands. So you might look at, a reservation or a map of the United States with reservation lands overlaid. Tribes or states can't tax, they can't imply their own laws. That belongs to the jurisdiction of tribes. But one of the last parts of this is that we're actually defined as distinct political communities. So when I said that we're a little bit different than other sort of minority groups, this is a big part of it. In some states, like here in Arizona, there's laws basically outlining the use of affirmative action in decision-making for admissions to school, universities. But this doesn't apply to tribes because we are considered a political class and like refugees or something like that. And so as a result, there's these sort of weird little loopholes and things that exist because we're effectively citizens of two nations. The last thing to sort of highlight, and this will matter later when we talk about Bears Ears and public lands and things of that sort, is that at the end of the day, the United States government, by law, has to relate to tribes and Native peoples at a government-to-government relationship, just as like the United States would talk to Canada and the Canadian government, not individual Canadians, and that's because that's largely the result of treaties. The United States signed treaties with tribal governments, recognized their sort of ability to self-govern. For better or for worse, it's sort of undercut some of the other things that have followed. But one of the things is important to note is that there's this idea of federal Indian trust responsibility. A lot of these treaties were signed in large part in the following war. So the tribes were giving up or forced to give up land in exchange for healthcare, money, education, these sorts of things. These are enshrined in treaties. And these are unique to all tribes. Each treaty is different, but the important thing to note is that some tribes get education, some tribes get healthcare, because this is seen as sort of the rent due for the land that was taken. So these things might seem really far off with treaties and like things in the past, but we've had two very major court cases that relate to Indian treaties that were from the 1860s. The first of these in 2019, I think, I don't even remember when COVID started, but these both kind of happened right in the mix of the chaos. But the first of these cases, Herrera versus Wyoming, basically there was a Crow tribal member that was hunting on U.S. Forest Service land without a a permit or a tag or a license from the state of Wyoming in which this hunting was occurring. And the Herrera basically shot an elk, was then arrested by the Wyoming Fish and Wildlife or whoever, the Wyoming State Police, for poaching. And Herrera cited the treaty that his people had signed with the federal government in 1868 and said, we have the right to hunt on the, quote, the unoccupied lands of the United States. And this was ratified by Congress. Congress didn't say otherwise. And therefore, we're able to, basically he could hunt on these lands. And what was interesting is that the Supreme Court sided with Herrera, the tribal member, and throughout this conviction. I think the one thing I'd like to highlight here is that if you look at the distribution of the justices that voted for this, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was the swing vote in this, in large part because she historically had been fairly antagonistic to tribal rights off of reservation lands. The person that wasn't was Neil Gorsuch. Neil has, he basically had a long-standing history with federal Indian law, basically more than any other federal justice on the bench in the past 100 years. So his understanding of tribal law and treaties was pretty outstanding. So anyways, this was kind of came out of left field a little bit. But this applies to other treaties and other Forest Service lands here. The next one that's a little bit, I would say a little bit more wild is this one. I mentioned Oklahoma earlier. So most of Oklahoma historically and now is reservation land. Oklahoma originally was designated the Indian Territory. So as Native peoples were getting displaced from the East Coast, there was Indian wars, they would send them to Oklahoma to kind of put them in a corral, more or less. And so, but I think the important thing to note is that what happened in the 1800s, 1900s is that, oops, there's a bunch of oil underneath the land. And so things changed. There's a book or in a movie, I believe, called Killers of the Flower Moon or something like that, that's going to be coming out. This is about that history.
I read the book. It's fascinating. Really fascinating.
And just for like a little bit of note, the Osage people who were here were at one point the richest people in the United States because of the oil, and that quickly got swindled and people got murdered. And that's how the FBI got created. So a little bit of an aside, but I skipped over that one. So the one thing to note is that there was this case brought to the Supreme Court in 2020, McGirt versus Oklahoma. But what happened in this case is that there was a Creek tribal member who murdered someone, I believe it was his fiance or something on tribal land, heinous crime. But the state of Oklahoma decided basically was the entity that was prosecuting McGirt, and McGirt basically argued that the state of Oklahoma didn't have any jurisdiction because this crime was committed within the historical boundaries of the Creek Reservation. And one of the things to note here is that the state of Oklahoma and other federal entities neglected recognizing Creek, tribal sovereignty in eastern Oklahoma. So effectively, it never was in effect. But if you look at this dispersion of who voted for this particular law, you say it again, Niels Gorsuch and Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the side of this. The main piece of what undergirded this decision is basically the court. What the heck? Looks like I got a timer on sharing for some reason. Anyways, if I go out, we'll see. But the big takeaway here is that Congress never undid or rescinded the treaty that they signed with the Creeks. So these sort of traditional historical boundaries that existed when the tribe originally had signed the treaty with the United States are still in effect. And so what does that mean? It means that like most of Oklahoma is now considered, this chunk of Oklahoma is considered now Indian reservation. And the big thing is that if you can look in the news in Oklahoma, but this still remains one of the biggest issues in the state of Oklahoma, in large part because much of the oil reserves of the state lie in the eastern part of the state. So the tribes now have taxation power. They now have the ability to regulate the environmental rules around drilling, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it can go to major crimes. It can go to a whole host of things. But it's led to a lot of really interesting politics in the state of Oklahoma in the past year. So Governor Stitt, he's actually a member of the Cherokee Nation, but he's vastly opposed to this law or to this ruling and what it's meant. But part of what's occurring after this is that now the state of Oklahoma and the tribes are now negotiating how they're going to basically co-govern the state of Oklahoma. And the important thing to note is that this isn't just, these treaties aren't just limited to Oklahoma or to Wyoming, they're all over the West. So let's take a jump into federal public lands, and I'll reference back about how these tribal sovereignty fits into this. But as I mentioned before, federal Indian trust land is considered a type of federal land, but we have a whole host of land agencies that oversee the management of federal land. So you can see in red here that these are all of the sort of parcels that are owned by the federal government, and they are basically overseen by mainly 5 agencies. The one that isn't listed here is the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but this is also under the Department of Interior. The main thing to note is that each of these federal agencies, this is a list, but they all have their own mandates about how they manage these landscapes. I like to think of things like the Bureau of Bureau Land Management. You can disperse camp. It's like pretty easy to go prospecting and do all kinds of things on this land. Whereas if you get to things like national parks, which are overseen, it's a lot harder. There's a lot more regulations. One thing I want to highlight, though, is things like the Forest Service are under the U.S. Department of Agriculture, because that's a reflection of how the federal government views those lands, as they're seen as sort of a crop to be harvested, such as timber or whatever resources may lie upon it. So there's a lot of conflicting things here, and tribes have to interface with all of these agencies on these historical lands. So next I'll talk a little bit about national parks and wilderness, because one of the things is that these are sort of considered the crown jewels of federal land management in the United States, but they also have a complicated history. It's also something that we've exported to other countries and sort of will be our legacy in many ways, for both good and bad. One of the things that you might have learned at some point is this idea of manifest destiny. But basically, there was a belief in the 19th century that there was a God-ordained right and sort of future of the United States to be one contiguous nation from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But one of the things is that what stood in the way of this was indigenous peoples. Indians lived and roamed on this land that, was basically preventing the expansion of this nation. And in the sort of view of Americans in the 19th century, there was a belief that Native peoples were going extinct, and, basically displacing them from their lands, putting them on reservations will allow them sort of a gentle glide path into the grave. And the big thing is that this, in large part, undergirded a lot of the violence that followed in the westward expansion beginning in the 1820s and 30s. So I mentioned some of those earlier cases of the Marshall Trilogy. These were large parts, sort of the conflicts between the Cherokee Nations and tribes with like early settlers on the East Coast in like Georgia and other places. But there was a common belief up until, hopefully not anymore, but that, there was a common phrasing, which is mentioned there, is the Indian problem. And it was constantly this battle and this debate within the United States of extermination or reformation. There was largely two camps within the United States about how this would occur. In much of the earlier days of the United States, much of the violence didn't occur on the hands of the U.S. military, but often settlers that would be moving out and creating their own militias in these sort of lands closest to tribes. But one of the pieces is that this warfare meant that this violence eventually would escalate and lead to more warfare. But at the time, there was a common belief across both of these camps that, Native peoples are an obstruction to national self-interest and commercial expansion. And, I would just want to highlight that some of these sentiments are echoed in even recent things like the Dakota Access Pipeline as well. In other recent fights against pipelines, you see some very similar rhetoric arise. What's going on here? Okay. So the next of, so taking a look at this history a little bit, taking a step back a few decades, one of the big sort of framing elements of this Indian problem in large part can be traced back to the War of 1812. One of the things I just want to highlight is if you look at sort of this breakdown of who was on each side of this war, on one side you have the United States, and then you have the United Kingdom and others on the other. But you have tribes on each side of this. And in large part, this was a reflection of sort of the political interests of tribes and the colonial states that were in the Americas at that time. So one of the important pieces, though, is that tribes were very critical to the war efforts on both sides. And so in the case of the United States won this war, but what eventually came out of this was there was a fairly strong anti-Indian faction in the United States government that created a number of congressmen and eventually 2 presidents. There we go. That now basically included 2 congressmen and 2 presidents, President Harrison and Andrew Jackson. The important thing to note is that folks like Andrew Jackson were known as the Indian killers, in large part because they held some very genocidal views of Native people and what should happen to them. In large part, this can be traced to the War of 1812. One of Andrew Jackson's, one of his defining pieces of legislation that he began lobbying for way before he even became president was this idea of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Basically, this led to what was known as the Trail of Tears, the creation of the Oklahoma Indian Territory, and basically the deaths of close to 1/3 of Cherokees and other tribes that were marched to Oklahoma. But this treaty, which is basically tied to the McGirt versus Oklahoma case that was litigated last year in the Supreme Court, has its roots in this Indian removal. These tribes signed treaties with the United States, basically forever securing their homelands within the Oklahoma Territory. And tribes went on that long journey, and many of them died basically believing that promise. And in many regards, there was a belief that, Indian removal was, in some regards, had a humanitarian basis. It would be better off. They wouldn't have to face settler violence. And there was definitely truth to that. Much of the violence up until this point was not occurring by the U.S. Army or the U.S. military, it was often by settlers. And so, for better or for worse, this happened. So kind of speeding up to the Civil War, one of the things that began happening is that there was definitely, I want to highlight, there was still, Indian battles and Indian wars occurring between 1830 and 1860, but around 1860, these Indian wars began to accelerate. And if you might remember earlier, I kind of mentioned that there was this sort of political battle about whether the Indian problem should be solved through genocide, extermination, or reformation. The Civil War began, it traumatized a lot of Americans with the amount of violence. There was a lot of hesitancy of continuing to fight in Indian wars, even though they began to happen more and more after 1860. But the important thing is that the Reformation crowd began to gain a stronger foothold in how to deal with this Indian problem. And so what then followed was the creation of the Carlisle Indian School, which is basically these young boys here. Basically, Indian children were then forcibly removed by federal law. There was federal laws that supported this, and placed into boarding schools in which they would effectively have their culture and identity stripped from them. So you can see that fairly radical transformation in the children's physical appearance, but that also occurred through physical violence of coercion and not allowing them to speak their native languages or practice their traditional religions, or allowing them to return home for years. But in the eyes of the reformists, this was a less brutal way to deal with the Indian problem. But the important thing to note is that this is still, by UN definitions today, this is still considered genocide. One of the things, just kind of a small aside, is that even, when we look at sort of the sides of history, there's a wonderful book if you're interested in reading about indigenous slavery. So like until about 1820, there's more Native peoples being enslaved than African slaves, and the scale of indigenous slavery in the Americas is about the same. But there was Native peoples on both sides of this. And the Cherokees and a number of the tribes on the East Coast actually participated in African slave trade and also in the enslavement of other Native peoples. In large part, part of this was they were justifying this as said, if we don't do this, we're going to be enslaved ourselves. And so there was a number of Cherokees that fought on both sides of the fought with the Confederate and the Union Army. In large part, one faction trying to maintain the institutional slavery, and the other that didn't agree with that at all. And this split the tribe. So if you're interested in reading about this history, this is a really interesting book. But again, the history is complex. But Civil War winds to a close. But what was occurring during this time, during the Civil War as well, was these number of Indian wars out west. Where I live in Tucson, it actually was, so if you look way down, there's Canyon de los Embudos, which was kind of a battle between the United States government and Geronimo in Mexico. But this was actually Confederate territory for quite a long time. There was Confederate battles fought here, but there was also a lot of battles fought between the Apaches and others. But as this westward expansion occurred, as the development of the Intercontinental Railroad and the movement of settlers into the West, you see these increasing amounts of conflict. In large part, some of it was, of course, aggression by tribes, by folks moving in, but also some of it was fair. A lot of it was mostly unilateral violence. My people, you can kind of see in the northwestern corner of Arizona, Canyon de Chelly, 1864. We were rounded up there. We were about 8,000 Navajos at that point, and marched to an internment camp in eastern New Mexico, and about a quarter to a third of our population died. We were marched in the middle of January. Lots of violence. Basically people that couldn't keep up were shot. Pregnant women were shot. It was a fairly violent time. But this was very much the sentiment at the time. The United States military, following the Civil War, became incredibly sophisticated and incredibly skilled. And so basically these Indian wars became fairly brutal. But the important thing to note is that this history is fairly recent. The most recent of these Indian wars, these Indian battles, was in 1924. Just for reference, all of my grandparents were alive when this happened. But there was sort of a scuffle between a group of Apaches who were actually living in Mexico with some Arizona ranchers, and the ranchers accused the natives of stealing some cattle. Didn't happen, but the cavalry army was called up, and but yeah, they're fairly recent in our backyard. But one of the pieces I want to highlight in this is that places like California, I would say there was a lot of brutality that occurred in the West, but one of the places that has some of the most significant brutality is California, in large part because of the mineral resources like gold that existed there. And part of this was, they didn't want to recognize Indian treaties. They wouldn't respect any of these treaties that were signed by the United States in these tribes. But at its core, the first civilian governor, Peter Burnett, he ran his platform, his sole platform running for governor of California was that of Indian genocide, which is kind of insane to think about a political a candidate for office running on that as his sole platform, but it was. And in part, there was such a, you think about the gold rush in 1849 and everything that followed. Indian peoples were standing in the way of this sort of wealth accumulation that was occurring in the state. One of the things that was very formative in the West and what, sort of began putting environmental pressures onto lands in the West was things like the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act in large part was to incentivize and subsidize the movement of white settlers into the West. And so basically the federal government parceled out 160 acres of land and basically allowed people to move into what was historically Indian territory. So one of the things is that to highlight is that there's quite a bit of land that was privatized in this process, 270 million acres of what was Indian land. And this occurred, over the course of a number of decades. This is a lot of text, but the important thing to note is that one of the things that began happening is that there was the next sort of erosion of tribal lands and tribal holdings was this thing called the General Allotment Act. Very similar to this thing called the Homestead Act, but it was applied to tribes. And so basically the federal government said, hey, Indian peoples, instead of killing you all, we're going to try to assimilate you into a ranching and farming lifestyle. And so what we will give you is 160 acres. We're not going to really pay attention to if that makes sense for your sort of cultural or economic system. And what it meant is that, a lot of Native peoples who had never operated in a cash economy were soon thrown into the deep end. And many were forced, had to pay taxes on these new 160 acre parcels. And what ended up happening is that many Native peoples ended up not being able to pay the taxes within the first couple of years of owning this land. But also, the allotment that would occur is that the federal government would just say, oh, there's surplus land that, used to belong to these Indians and would then be sold to non-natives, even if, and natives were basically excluded from being able to purchase any of that extra land. So this has created a mess in some ways. This is near my home community, but this is kind of what we look at when we call this checkerboard land. And the main thing to note is that there's a lot of different landowners on this. You have this Navajo trust land, this sort of dark brown color, which is like sort of what you think about as reservation land. Navajo fee land is basically the tribe buying back parcels of land that once belonged. And then allotment land. So these are like sort of pieces of land that were given to individual Indian landholders, and then things like BLM land, private land. But you think about this from a perspective of, say, a government, or like, say you're a tribal utility, trying to provide electricity to your people. You're having to cross multiple types of jurisdictions and land. It starts to become a real headache. But this has been one of the sort of legacies is that during this time, close to over half of reservation land was lost due to the Dawes Act. And this was all legal means that this occurred. But during this time, there was a lot of advertisement for Indian land. You would have a lot of tourism, for example, of taking the railroads and viewing these places in which, white settlers could come. So on the right, is sort of a advertisement that was put in newspapers in the East Coast to come to places like Glacier National Park and others to purchase these lands that Native peoples had very recently been dispossessed from. So this is where things get kind of really weird. So this, 1873 occurs. This is, this law has been occurring for, of Indian allotments have been occurring for 20 years. The one thing that the federal government ran into is that the federal government didn't have a definitions for themselves about who was Native and who was not. So they didn't know who to give this land to or not give this land to. And in many instances, tribes all defined what it meant to be a tribal citizen very differently. Whether you spoke the language or you had familial descent, or, there's a lot of different ways in which you think about being a citizen of a nation. It can occur in a lot of different ways. The federal government at the time in Congress wanted to standardize this. And they said, well, we don't know, but we're going to try this thing called blood quantum. I want to highlight here, there's only a few things in this country that are measured by blood quantum: cattle, horses, dogs, and Indians. Those are the things that still exist to this day. This law is still on the books. So what that meant is that often these blood quantums, 100% Indian, 50% Indian, 25% Indian, would be, in many instances, arbitrarily assigned. So the sort of 100% Indian denotions would be given to people that the federal agents would deem as poorly assimilated or legally incompetent. And folks that would be lighter skinned would often be assigned a lower quantum. But the important thing to note is that these were very arbitrary rules applied to tribes, and it didn't matter what the tribe thought, but this has had some pretty devastating effects on communities still to this day.
So Len, in my mind, like blood quantum, I was thinking DNA tests, but that's not actually what it was based off of, or like a blood analysis or something. It was literally like they were just looking at people and saying,
oh, you look 50% Indian.
Oh my gosh, okay.
So the important thing to note is that much of this lore about how much Indian you are and how much it relates to blood tests that you can get online is still a legacy of that history of that law. So, but one of the things that, was sort of the undercurrent in what was occurring here at this time was this idea of the romanticism in the wilderness. And you can see that basically there's this lone Indian standing on the cliff, but there was this belief that man and nature were different. And so the creation of reservations and national parks, in large part, there was a belief that Native peoples needed to be separated from the lands that they were living in because it was too nice for them to be living there, right? So the creation of the reservation system and the creation of our national parks coincided. There was one Lakota elder that basically said that they created a park for the four-leggeds and a park for the two-leggeds. And what you see is sort of undergirding a lot of these beliefs is that there was, these national parks are not places where Native people spent a lot of time. And, I don't want to throw Teddy Roosevelt too much under the bus, but, in many cases, this is, white supremacy was something that undergirded a lot of these beliefs. This is his quote, and he's standing right next to John Muir. I want to highlight, though, that he did create the Antiquities Act, which we'll talk about in a second. But one of the things that you see I'm just going to very quickly go through these, but you have federal laws that create things like the National Park, the Organic Acts, federal lands. There's no mention of Native peoples or the treaties that may apply to them. Still to this day. And what you see with things like the Wilderness Act of 1864 was this reinforcement of this idea that there was no people that lived in these places before. In many ways, this sort of justified the removal. If you said that, well, Native peoples never really spent time here, there wasn't long history, it meant all of our parks have histories dating back thousands of years. But this was enshrined in law. So, so I want to turn this on its head and bring it up to the 20th century and talk about Bears Ears. This is important. This is relevant and this matters. This is right in our backyard in the West. But we're talking about national monuments now, different type of federal land. But at its core was Teddy Roosevelt was the president that signed this and created the first national monuments. But then what the Antiquities Act is that in the Constitution, it basically says Congress has the duty to manage lands and resources of the United States. However, what was beginning to be seen in the early 20th century is that there was a lot of looting occurring of archaeological sites. There was a lot of theft of, grave theft and grave robbing, in large part because universities and museums were wanting to collect artifacts. And the federal government saw this as an issue, but Congress couldn't move quick enough to protect these areas. So the Antiquities Act carved out some of that power and authority and gave it to the executive, the president, because the executive can act much more quickly. So presidents can designate national monuments, it dedicates resources, it provides protection. And the first of these was Bears Lodge, Devil's Tower was our first national monument. And so the important thing to note is that it wasn't in the view of tribes were never seen as the people who would force this sort of legislation, but that's what changed with Bears Ears. So when we talk about Bears Ears, this is, this southeastern Utah, wonderful place. It's a huge area. This is just one, these are the Bears Ears, but it's a huge area that encompasses a lot of places. There's history dating back here 15,000 years. Amazing amount of archaeological sites. There's 100,000 known archaeological sites within the boundaries of the Bears Ears. That's more than all of the other national park units combined. This is basically the multiple tribes call this area home. And this is some place that has a lot of historical value. Anywhere else in the world, this would be a national park. So I mentioned archaeological theft. One of the things is that there's some of the early Mormon communities in that area. Basically, we're still offering archaeological badges to Boy Scouts for hunting pots and archaeological pieces up until 2009. Very recently, and there's a very big industry for Indian artifacts. So this in 2009, why did it stop? It's because the FBI and Bureau of Land Management basically said, hey, there's a lot of theft occurring here. And they raided a number of homes and communities within Blanding and recovered somewhere close to 50,000 archaeological pieces. And they had to rent an entire warehouse in Utah or in Salt Lake to store all these. But it led to a lot of concern among tribes about how do you protect these sort of ancestral homelands. So this is what formed the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition. 5 tribes who call this area home came together and said, we're going to put aside historical differences. I want to highlight that my tribe, the Navajo tribe, and the Ute tribes do not get along at all. But we put that aside in large part to protect these areas. And the way in which we did that was partnering also with outdoor rec groups. So one of the pieces that was really key here was working alongside the outdoor industry. And so part of this, Aaron Mike, you saw him in the earlier photos when I was talking about climbing in Cochise. He was that bridge. He's a climber, but he also is Navajo and sort of built that bridge between the tribes and climbers in protecting this area. Gosh, my thing is like laggy. 2016 an election happens and priorities change around national monuments. I was working for the Department of Energy. I quickly left. But in large part, this was because of what happened. There was this reduction in looking at reducing Bears Ears and this new monument that President Obama had designated. So just want to highlight that the original monument was about 1.8 million acres in that green area there. And it was reduced by President Trump at the end of 2017 into these 2 units, Indian Creek and Shusha. It was about 85% reduction. And this occurred to the monument just over Lake Powell at Grand Staircase Escalante. And very important, this was actually a thing that I leaked to the New York Times, but there was, basically a lot of pressures being put on the development of fossil fuel resources in this area. So again, you can see there's a competing interest around how that should be managed. But the important thing to note is that these are the places that were left unprotected and still are under, until the monument's restored. These are sites dating back to, over 1,000 years. Oops, why is this not changing? It's quite an amazing place if you haven't had a chance to go. So bringing us onto the contemporary, one of the things that happened was this sort of exodus of retailers from the Outdoor Retailer Show in 2017. It was being held, this show brings in, $45 million at the time, $45 million in local spending to Salt Lake. This is where the show was held. So the first year I went, there was these protests that were happening in companies like Patagonia, REI, North Face began pulling out of the show. And the show was then put up for bid, and the state of Utah was not allowed to basically bid for the show to return, in large part because companies were complaining that, the state wasn't supporting the protection of national monuments and the protection of public lands, and therefore wasn't a good fit. So I'm currently on the advisory panel for the state of Colorado's Outdoor Recreation Advisory Board. This was like my first meeting when we were coming up with the pitch. And we decided to poke a little fun at Utah for their weak beer and their small mountains. But this was the pitch that we gave. But alongside that, we also gave this pitch of saying, like, if this show comes to Colorado, we're going to engage with tribes and talk about how do we manage, how do we sort of play in the same areas and like manage these public lands in a way that, you know, sees the interests of both the outdoor industry and tribes around this. And so that first year we brought together 27 tribes to talk about this issue, and we didn't allow the federal government to come out.
Do you feel like since then, and like since this kind of revolt against it, that the state of Utah has kind of stepped up to protect more, or do you feel like that's still like a very heated and like needed thing?
It's very heated in the state. And the other thing to note is that the state of Utah has very antagonistic relationships with the tribes within the state. So, you know, it was already, tribes didn't trust the state already. So it was kind of reason to do it already. So sort of my entry into the outdoor industry was doing this sort of education center, and you know, raising money to build this education center that you can now visit in Bluff. But one of the things I want to highlight is where the Bears Ear stands is, you know, it was a significant victory in many ways for tribes because they were able to leverage the use of the Antiquities Act in a way that Teddy Roosevelt did not intend tribes to do. But it did mean that there was a fairly large protection of land that occurred and will likely come out of it. Lawsuits are still pending. The current administration is not representing them, so they're still kind of in limbo. But really, it depends on what the administration, Secretary of Interior, and President Biden end up deciding doing. They'll likely bring it back. It sounds like from my talks with the folks that are on the inside that it will be a bigger monument. But the most significant piece of this is that Deb Haaland was nominated as Secretary of Interior, first Native American to ever hold this position. This was also the position that oversaw a lot of these sort of Indian removals and terrible things that occurred over a century ago. So it's fairly significant in that regard. I don't know what's happening with this. So the main thing I would just take away from that is that when we look at that sort of larger arc of history, it's complicated. You know, a lot of that Indian removal occurred. It has its legacies, but in some ways there's things that have changed and are different. And I think especially on the sort of the light of how do we recreate in our own backyard, you know, like knowing that history is key. And also this ties that tribes still have to those landscapes. But, you know, the main thing is so much of that history really is contextual on where you're at and the tribes that, you know, have historically called that home. Anyways, that was kind of a little bit of a fire hose, but kind of gives you that giant arc of where we find ourselves today.
Yeah. I have a question that ties into what you were just talking about like history and then kind of merging it with modern day. And we have a DEI conversation every month, and something that came up for me was just, you know, how do we discuss people like Teddy Roosevelt that, you know, did some things that were really great and monumental, but also have really disturbing and controversial, you know, takes on minority groups or people that are like underrepresented and like said really awful things about communities. Like how do you honor the good and also own the bad? Like how do you honor the communities and also say like they did some things that were like kind of okay as well?
Yeah, totally. And I think that's the you know, in studying history, one of the precepts I was taught is you have to have as much compassion for the oppressed as the oppressor. And, you know, some people might drag me for saying that, but, you know, I think especially, you know, people exist and live within the context that they are in. You know, some of the things that we may believe or do now within 100 years might not be, you know, seen as legitimate or correct. I mean, that's inevitable. That's how history works and cultures evolve. I think, you know, in terms of how do you deal with that sort of complication, you know, it's like Teddy Roosevelt had some antiquated views on Native peoples, but he also he was protecting landscapes in a way that also protected tribes' interests to a certain degree as well. And I think one of the things that's kind of hard, well, I mean, if the hard thing to do online is you know, especially in social media, is that it either gets framed as black or white. And I think that's where, that's where, like, I don't have, Teddy Roosevelt has some messed up views, but he also had some great views as well. So it's kind of like appraising sort of what the impacts were and what the positive things as were as well. And I don't know. I mean, I just want to say there's some Native people that don't have a view on Teddy Roosevelt, and there's some that absolutely hate him. And
Yes.
I think I'm somewhere in, like, I don't know.
Yeah, that was just an example. But
Yeah.
when we are talking as a team about how we can be allies to our, our Native and Indigenous communities, because like we're also based in Mesa, Arizona.
Yep.
So like we're, very aware, and like we have a lot of connections in like the Navajo community.
Yep.
It's like, how do we show up and like support and like respect all of these communities, but also like be advocates for the outdoors without stepping on toes or
Yep.
saying things that end up being disrespectful, right? Like, because we want to show that we are standing up and supporting everyone too. So it's not a black and white situation. Yeah, and it's like it's tricky too because we want to do what's best and respect.
Yeah, and I think, I think especially with Bears Ears, it's like, I mean, sort of that arc of like, there's a long standing history here. And I think much of what we have been taught has just only been the past 200 years, 300 years. And I think like the important thing to note is that civilizations have rose and fall in the places that we live. And like, I'm a descendant of those people, just as like everyone else is a descendant of other peoples across the world. But yeah, I think that's there's a lot of amazing history and stories that can be told. And, I actually know of an archaeological site right down in the middle of Mesa that I have like longstanding connections to through one of my Hopi tribes or clans. So,
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's an amazing history, but it's also something that we can partake in and understand. We don't choose the history we're born into, but we choose what we do when we learn about it.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I think that's another thing too that you touched on when you were saying, we view this as lands that people weren't occupying before, which is not true. And obviously there were clans is the proper term, I would assume, if we're talking about a group, but there were clans of people living on this land, but we don't want to acknowledge that. And I'm wondering how that ties into, or if you think it does, with there was a lot of controversy around like geotagging and leave no trace and like kind of gatekeeping lands and like saying that it's for certain communities but not others. And I'm curious what your thoughts are around that, and considering that land was never ours in the first place.
Yeah.
So act like that.
I mean, I think, well, first, when we talk about the 574 tribes, some tribes believe in land ownership and have a model that's very similar to what we see in Western societies. There's others that don't. Mm-hmm. If anyone tells you otherwise, they're making it up. There's a lot of diversity in that. And not all tribes managed land. Some tribes manage land very well. Some tribes manage lands very poorly. It's it's sort of a mixed bag there as well. And I think to hold Native peoples up on a pedestal and say that we did an amazing job across the board is like ignoring history in a way too. Mm-hmm. We did do, but in some ways we are a little bit more aware because we have messed up. And I think about our sort of Navajo creation story. We're in the Navajo creation story, we're in the fifth world right now. And basically we've left the past four because we've either created environmental harm and imbalance so much so that we had to find a new home, or it created some sort of societal imbalance. And so in sort of our thinking, Navajo thinking, and the way I can think about our sort of care about the environment in large part is informed about like continuation of civilization. That being said, I think when we talk about leave no trace and those sorts of things, like those things are important and they matter because they come from a cultural framework that is not ours, but like, for other people that aren't me or Navajo people, is an important framework for understanding how to minimize your impact. The one thing I want to highlight about leave no trace is that it might not work best for tribes because, for example, like we participate in like ceremonial practices in which we gather herbs or leave offerings, like leave things out there. And I remember, one instance I was collecting herbs with my grandfather. He was a traditional medicine person, and some person like started chiding us for picking the herbs from the plant, but then also leaving some, biodegradable offerings like corn pollen and some other things. And it was just one of those moments where it was like culture clash.
Mm.
But I think one of the things that I would say, if we think about what an indigenous L&T looks like, and I would almost push L&T a little bit more, is like, can we think about a relationship with the environment that is based on reciprocity? We might not be taking resources when we go hiking, but we're extracting an experience. And so we're kind of reinforcing a cultural norm in a way that in some instances Native people might not agree with. So, giving back doesn't mean just like, placing a cornmeal offering, or whatever it is, but it means like, is there ways in which you can give back and to like clean up and take care of a place? That's giving back too, and that sort of relationship of reciprocity. And I would say, like, if we can move towards that, that may be the middle ground between those perspectives.
I love that a lot. And even you talking about a relationship of reciprocity kind of reminds me of, we have read Braiding Sweetgrass. And so
Yeah, totally.
just that relationship of like, even if it's just giving gratitude and just being aware. And I think that kind of ties into with like modern day issues that we see with different communities of people that are not respecting or giving gratitude to the natural spaces. So whenever I reached out to you, it was because of an article that you had written about damaging like petroglyphs and things like that. So I wonder if you want to touch on that and like why that's damaging. And I think that also ties in with like the names of routes and like all of these things that are like really devastating to a community and like to like sacred spaces. So I'll open that up, but I really wanted to touch on that.
Yeah, totally. So I'm a climber. I've named routes, I put up routes, done that sort of thing. I would say, one of the things is always just like the history I presented may be new for folks here, but I think for many Native folks, that history and that knowledge and understanding of like how do we get here is much more proximate and much more a part of our sort of daily lives. And so it's very easy for, in the case of what occurred in Moab, and there's a sort of spate of defacement of petroglyphs in the Southwest. That's kind of, I don't know. I mean, it's like someone going to Arlington National Cemetery and defacing some of the rocks there. It's just like, it's not a good look across the board. But, I think, especially since it's public lands, it's like, it's not just our heritage now, it's this entire country's, and I think one of the things that we lose in that is that we lose that sort of long understanding of humanity and just how long, people have lived here, and hopefully we continue to have a functioning civilization that continues to live here. And I think that's one of the things that for many Native peoples, it's dehumanizing when that happens. I think when it comes to things like route naming and naming of peaks and things of that sort, it's kind of, I originally had some pretty dogmatic views about it, but I think one of the things is that there's also, cultural geography is one sort of line of study in the academy, and don't melt your brain reading that stuff. It's too crazy. It's too jargony. But the big takeaways is that, certain cultures view landscapes very differently. So for Native peoples, like my people, like we have 4 sacred mountains, but we don't view the highest point in that peak to be the summit. It's the entire massif. It's the entire sort of conglomeration of peaks. And so, at least in the Western tradition, it's, the sort of naming of each peak, and that has to have 300 feet of prominence to be considered a nameable peak, et cetera, et cetera. It's just different sort of cultural worldviews on what's worthy of naming. So when it comes to naming like specific cracks or climbing routes on a face, that's that's sort of a naming practice. That's the practice of naming in that particular instance is fairly new, but it's also fairly specific to, the climbing or skiing or whatever is being done there. I do think, however, one of the things when we do look at the things like namings of routes and things like that, it's again, we kind of run into the same thing about, we can always have 2020 when we look back in history. But, when we look at the things like the history of climbing, it in many ways, the sort of the earliest days of climbing in the 60s and 70s were young white men who were being rebellious to society, and in sort of doing something, they were sort of seen as outcasts within that as well, and were not deemed as legitimate, where they were in many ways were marginalized in their own way, and sort of I'm not trying to equate Native marginalization in theirs, but it was a similar sort of marginalization. So in many ways, what came with that was just sort of a rowdiness that I think, in retrospect, is, we can do what we need to correct those names, but the most egregious ones. But I think also understanding where it came from is just as important as doing the work to change it. And I think I've been working with I'm on the board for the American Alpine Club, and we've been doing some work on route naming and sort of the standards around that. And from a Native perspective, I would say, like, naming is a very sacred practice that we kind of, it's not something that we just do willy-nilly about. For example, like, just even naming a child, like, we don't even name a child or try to find out their gender until they're born. They don't even get their name until they have their first laugh. In part because I think that was our way of dealing with infant mortality. But, the other was just like sort of the traditions built around that was that, this is a sacred practice, you need to have a celebration around it. And I think having that intentionality with, the things we do outside is just as important, because it's a reflection of our society. And I think that's one of the things that, if we can be intentional with what we do, that's like, I don't know, one of the best legacies that we can leave for generations to come.
Love that. That's such a great perspective. Well, I would love to ask if anyone has any additional questions. I could ask a lot of questions, but I don't want to take up all the time. But anyone can unmute, or you can just drop your question in the chat, and I'm happy to ask it. And if not, then we can say thank you and let you go about your evening, because we've been on here for a while. But I appreciate this so much, because even just with the history, I feel like there's just so much deeper context to, like, how we should be approaching, viewing, and appreciating outdoor spaces, and like where all of this has come from, and why we need to be honoring and celebrating. I feel like we should do another chat that's about like land back and like a bunch of other things, because there's so much more I want to ask about, but then it's going to end up going on for like another hour. So
totally. Yeah. There's a whole political discussion right now.
Yes. Yeah. And it's interesting too, how deeply interwoven, politics and the environment and the outdoor spaces really are. I feel like, a lot of people don't even realize like how interconnected and just like powerfully mixed those things are, especially when it comes to how we're treating outdoor spaces, and who has been on these lands much longer than us. So
totally,
there's a lot to learn there.
Totally. Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks for coming out, and thanks.
Yes, thank you so much for taking the time to talk, and I'm really excited to share this with our community, and we'll be sharing all about you and Natives Outdoors as well. So I don't know if you want to just drop like your Instagram handles and like where people can find you and your community.
Oh man, if you want to follow, I drop a lot of memes, but that's our those are our two, and then last one. Cool.
Yeah. So if you want to follow Len, it's just Len Necefer, and then at Natives Outdoors, and then you can find Natives Outdoors online at www.natives-outdoors.com. So highly recommend following and just continuing to educate and have conversations. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bree.
Have a great night.
You too.
Bye.